A millionaire locks his 10-year-old daughter in a freezing basement for $2 million, leaving her for dead. But when she mysteriously returns the next day, her fury ignites a chilling chain of events that no one could predict. What she does next will shock everyone. Lila was an extraordinary 10-year-old girl with a gift for art that brought beauty to an otherwise cold and unwelcoming life. She lived in Denver, Colorado, in a modest, run-down house with her father, Mark. Mark, a 45-year-old struggling entrepreneur, was a man consumed by his failures and the debt that loomed over him like a shadow. To him, Lila wasn't a source of joy but a constant reminder of responsibilities he didn't want to bear. Mark's distant demeanor weighed heavily on Lila. She yearned for his affection and approval, clinging to moments of hope that one day, things would improve. Yet, Mark barely noticed her, often shutting himself in his office or taking late-night calls with an air of frustration. Even when Lila tried to share her paintings with him, vivid depictions of colorful landscapes and the dreams she held close, he dismissed them with a grunt or a distracted wave of his hand. One winter evening, as snow blanketed the city and frost formed on the windows, Mark sat alone in the dim light of the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he hesitated before picking it up. The name flashing on the screen sent a chill down his spine. Victor. Victor was a 50-year-old real estate tycoon known for his ruthless tactics and a personal vendetta against Mark's ex-wife, Claire. Years ago, Claire had rejected Victor's advances, choosing instead to focus on raising Lila as a single mother after Mark abandoned them. Victor's grudge had only grown with time, and now he had found a way to strike back. Mark answered the call reluctantly. "Victor," he said, his voice tense. "What do you want?" "Straight to business, as always," Victor replied, his tone dripping with mockery. "I have a proposition for you, Mark. One that could solve all your little financial problems." Mark clenched his jaw, already regretting picking up the phone. "I'm not interested in your games." "Oh, but you will be," Victor said with a smirk audible in his voice. $2 million, Mark. All I ask is that you ensure Lila disappears." Mark froze, his grip tightening on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Victor snapped. "That girl is a thorn in my side. Claire's pride and joy. I want her gone. You get the money, and your problems vanish along with her." Mark sat in stunned silence. The weight of his debts, the constant calls from creditors, the looming threat of losing everything. All of it pressed down on him like a vice. The offer was monstrous, but it was tempting. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What happens if I say no?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor laughed coldly. "You won't. Men like you don't walk away from this kind of opportunity." Mark ended the call without another word, his thoughts spiraling into darkness. He poured himself another drink, convincing himself it wasn't about the money, it was about survival. He told himself that Lila was better off with Claire anyway, that she deserved someone who cared about her in a way he couldn't. Yet, deep down, he knew these were just excuses. The next morning, Lila woke up early, her heart light with excitement. She had stayed up late working on a painting of her dream. A warm, vibrant meadow where she and her mother were together, laughing and happy. She held it carefully as she made her way downstairs, eager to show her father. "Dad!" she called, her voice cheerful as she entered the living room. Mark barely glanced at her, his face cold and unreadable. "Not now, Lila," he muttered, scrolling through his phone. "But I made this for you," she insisted, holding up the painting. It was a burst of color in an otherwise gray and lifeless room. Mark looked at it briefly, his expression unchanging. "I said not now," he repeated, his tone sharper. Lila's smile faded, but she didn't argue. She placed the painting on the table and retreated to her room, her heart heavy. Yet, she held on to hope as she always did. She pulled out her sketchpad and began to draw, immersing herself in the colors and lines that made the world feel brighter. As Christmas Eve approached, the tension in the house grew palpable. Mark's decision weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't bring himself to back out. That night, as Lila was preparing for bed, Mark called her downstairs. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice stern. Lila hesitated, sensing something was off, but she obeyed. She stood in front of him, clutching the sketchpad she always carried. "You've been difficult lately," Mark began, his words clipped and mechanical. "I need you to understand that actions have consequences." Lila frowned, confused. "What do you mean, Dad?" Without answering, Mark led her to the basement door and opened it. "You'll stay down here tonight. Think about what you've done." Fear crept into Lila's voice. "But I didn't do anything." "Go," Mark said firmly, pushing her gently but insistently. The cold air from the basement hit her like a wall, and she hesitated on the steps. "Dad, please," she began, but Mark closed the door, locking it with a deliberate click. Lila stood in the dark, trembling. She tried to call out, but Mark didn't respond. She wrapped her arms around herself, the freezing air biting at her skin. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she sank to the floor, clutching her sketchpad like a lifeline. In the silence above, Mark sat on the couch, staring at the door. He poured himself another drink, telling himself it would all be over soon. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a cold, indifferent white. As the hours dragged on, Lila's faint cries echoed through the basement. Upstairs, Mark's phone buzzed again. It was Victor. "Well?" Victor asked. "Is it done?" Mark hesitated, his voice low and uncertain. "Almost. Good," Victor said. "You'll have your money by morning." Mark ended the call, his gaze fixed on the basement door. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but he didn't move. Below, Lila huddled in the darkness, her sketchpad the only light in a world that felt colder than ever. The basement was icy cold, its bare concrete walls offering no comfort to Lila as she shivered in the dark. She hugged her knees, her fingers gripping the edges of her sketchpad. Drawing had always been her refuge, the one place where she could create a world far removed from the one she lived in. But tonight, even her art couldn't ward off the biting cold or the fear that crept into her heart. "Why is he doing this?" Lila whispered to herself, her breath visible in the freezing air. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at the blank page in her sketchpad, her pencil trembling in her hand. She tried to draw, but her fingers were too stiff from the cold. Slowly, exhaustion took over, and she curled up on the floor, clutching her pad like a shield. Upstairs, Mark sat in silence, staring at the flickering light of the television. He hadn't touched his drink since the call with Victor. His hand rested on his phone, but he couldn't bring himself to dial Claire's number. He told himself that this was the only way out, that Lila would be better off without him, that the money would solve everything. But a voice in the back of his mind kept whispering, "What have you done?" His guilt gnawed at him, but it was overshadowed by his desperation. He glanced at the envelope Victor had promised to deliver with the first installment of the payment. It sat on the coffee table, an ominous reminder of the path he had chosen. Mark rubbed his temples, trying to drown out the voice of doubt, but it only grew louder. Meanwhile, across town, Claire sat in her small apartment, flipping through old photo albums. She stopped at a picture of Lila when she was younger, her face beaming as she held up a colorful painting. Claire traced the edges of the photo with her finger, a soft smile on her lips. But her smile faded as a strange unease settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had tried calling Lila earlier that evening, but Mark hadn't answered. She knew he was often dismissive, but tonight it felt different. Grabbing her coat, Claire decided she couldn't ignore her instincts. She couldn't explain it, but she felt an urgency she hadn't felt in years. She rushed out into the snowy night, her breath visible in the freezing air as she hurried toward Mark's house. Lila stirred awake, her body trembling uncontrollably from the cold. The basement was pitch black except for the faint light filtering in through a small, frosted window. Her thoughts were muddled, fear and exhaustion battling for control. She tried to stand, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She looked at the basement door, hoping it would open, that her father would change his mind. But the house above remained silent. A noise caught her attention, a soft creaking sound from outside the house. Lila's heart raced, her mind conjuring images of something worse than the cold lurking outside. She crawled toward the window, peering out into the snowy night. She saw nothing but white, the snowflakes falling endlessly, covering the world in a cold, indifferent blanket. "Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wish you were here." When Claire arrived at Mark's house, she immediately noticed something was off. The lights were dim, and there was no sign of activity. She knocked on the door, her breath clouding the air as she waited for an answer. When none came, she knocked harder, her unease turning into panic. "Mark," she called. "Are you there? Where's Lila?" Inside, Mark froze. He had heard the knock but didn't move. His mind raced. What do I say? What do I do? Claire wasn't willing to wait. She tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Pushing it open, she stepped inside, calling out again. "Mark, where's Lila?" The sound of her voice jolted him out of his stupor. "Claire," he said, his voice unsteady as he appeared in the hallway. "Where's Lila?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the room. "I've been trying to reach her all night." Mark hesitated, his face pale. She's in her room." "No, she's not," Claire said, her voice rising. She took a step closer to him, her eyes narrowing. "What are you hiding, Mark?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Claire didn't wait. She noticed the basement door slightly ajar and instinctively moved toward it. "Don't!" Mark called after her, but she had already reached the door. She pulled it open and froze. The icy air hit her like a wall, and the faint sound of Lila's sobs reached her ears. "Lila!" Claire cried, rushing down the steps. Lila looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Mom!" she whispered, her voice weak. Claire scooped her into her arms, her heart pounding as she felt how cold Lila's body was. "It's okay, baby. I've got you," she said, her voice breaking. "You're safe now." She carried Lila up the stairs, her fury rising with every step. She turned to Mark, her eyes blazing. "How could you?" she shouted. "What kind of father does this to his child?" Mark had no answer. He stood frozen, guilt etched on his face, as Claire stormed past him and out the door. The snow continued to fall as Claire hurried to her car, cradling Lila in her arms. "I'll never let anything happen to you again," Claire whispered to her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "Never." As Claire drove toward the hospital, she glanced at Lila, who had fallen unconscious in her arms. Her heart ached with fear and anger. She didn't know the full extent of Mark's betrayal yet, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Back at the house, Mark stared at the empty basement door, his phone buzzing once more. It was Victor again. "Well?" Victor asked, his voice cold. "Did you finish the job?" Mark's hands trembled as he looked at the snow-covered driveway where Claire's car had disappeared. "No," he whispered. Victor's voice turned icy. "Then you've made a big mistake, Mark. A very big mistake." The hospital's fluorescent lights seemed harsh against the stillness of the snowy night. Claire paced outside the emergency room, her heart pounding. Lila had been rushed in moments ago, her small body wrapped in blankets to combat the severe cold. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Claire clenched her fists, anger and guilt swirling within her. How could Mark, the man she once trusted, sink so low? A nurse finally emerged, her expression serious but not grim. "Miss Claire?" she asked gently. Claire turned, her eyes filled with desperation. "Is she okay?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "She's stable," the nurse reassured her. "She's suffering from hypothermia, but we caught it in time. She'll need to stay here for observation. But she's a strong little girl." Relief washed over Claire, and she slumped into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Inside Lila's room, the beeping of monitors broke the silence. Lila stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find Claire sitting by her bedside. "Mom," Lila murmured, her voice weak. "I'm here, sweetheart," Claire said, taking her daughter's hand in hers. "You're safe now." Tears welled in Lila's eyes. "Why did Dad do that?" What did I do wrong? Claire's heart shattered. She stroked Lila's hair gently, trying to keep her voice steady. You didn't do anything wrong, my love. This isn't your fault. Meanwhile, back at the house, Mark sat in the living room, staring at his phone. Victor's threats echoed in his mind, each word tightening the noose around him. He knew he had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. The phone buzzed again. It was Victor. Mark hesitated before answering, his voice shaking. Victor, I couldn't do it. Claire showed up. Victor's icy laugh sent chills down Mark's spine. You're as useless as I thought. Do you realize what this means? I just need more time, Mark pleaded. I can fix this. Victor's tone turned deadly. You had one job, Mark. One job. Now you've not only failed me, but you've also dragged me into this mess. You better hope the police don't come knocking. Mark's hands trembled as he ended the call. He looked around the house, the walls closing in on him. His desperation had brought him to this point, and now there was no escape. The next morning, Claire sat in Lila's hospital room, holding a cup of coffee she had barely touched. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but she needed answers. After ensuring Lila was resting, she stepped outside to make a call. Detective Reed, she said when the line connected. I need to report something about my daughter and her father. Within an hour, Detective Reed, a seasoned investigator in his early 40s, arrived at the hospital. His calm demeanor and sharp eyes gave Claire a glimmer of hope. Miss Claire, I understand you have concerns about your daughter's safety, Reed said, taking a seat across from her. Concerns? Claire snapped, her voice filled with anger. Mark locked her in a freezing basement. He could have killed her. Reed nodded, his expression serious. I'll need as much detail as you can give me. Was there anything unusual leading up to this? Claire hesitated before speaking, recalling the odd tension in Mark's voice the last time she called him. He's been distant, but last night, something felt wrong. I think someone else is involved. Reed's eyebrows furrowed. What makes you think that? Claire explained how Mark had always been a coward, incapable of such a calculated act on his own. She mentioned Victor, the man who had held a grudge against her for years. I don't have proof, but I know Victor has something to do with this, Claire said. He's dangerous, detective. If he's involved, my daughter's life is still in danger. Reed took notes, his expression growing more serious with each word. We'll look into Victor, he assured her. But we'll also need to speak with Mark. At Mark's house, the tension was palpable when Detective Reed and his team knocked on the door. Mark opened it reluctantly, his face pale. Mark, Reed said firmly. We need to ask you some questions about last night. Mark's first instinct was to deny everything, but under the detective's probing gaze, his defenses crumbled. It was Victor, he blurted out, his voice shaking. He offered me money. $2 million. To get rid of Lila. Reed's jaw tightened, and he signaled his team to take Mark into custody. You've just admitted to conspiring against your daughter, he said coldly. Anything you say now will be used against you. As Mark was led away, he muttered, You don't understand. Victor's the real villain here. Back at the hospital, Claire sat beside Lila as Detective Reed updated her on Mark's arrest. Lila listened quietly, her small hand clutching Claire's tightly. So Dad, really? Lila's voice trailed off, tears filling her eyes. Claire hugged her tightly. It's over, sweetheart. You're safe now. But deep down, Claire knew it wasn't over. Victor was still out there, and his influence loomed like a shadow. We'll get him too, Claire vowed, her eyes burning with determination. That night, as Claire stayed by Lila's side, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered. Claire, Victor's chilling voice came through. I see you're still fighting. But let me warn you. This isn't a game you can win. Claire's grip tightened on the phone. Stay away from my daughter. Victor laughed, a sound that made her blood run cold. You're out of your depth, Claire. I'll be seeing you soon. As the line went dead, Claire's resolve hardened. She looked at Lila, sleeping peacefully, and whispered, Not if I see you first. Claire knew Victor wouldn't stop. His chilling warning still echoed in her mind as she stood outside the police station the next morning. With Lila safe in the hospital under protective watch, Claire was determined to end Victor's reign of terror once and for all. Detective Reed greeted her at the door, his expression both reassuring and serious. "We've tracked Victor's movements," Reed said as they walked to his office. "He's been careful but not careful enough. He's staying at a private estate just outside the city. We'll need your help to connect the dots." Claire nodded, her determination unwavering. "Whatever you need, I'll do it. I won't let him hurt my daughter, or anyone else." Reed placed a file on the desk. Inside were photos of Victor, financial transactions, and a list of known associates. Claire's eyes scanned the documents, her anger building. Among the evidence was a suspicious wire transfer to Mark, a clear connection to Victor's plot. "This is enough to implicate him," Reed said. "But we need more concrete evidence to take him down for good." Claire hesitated, then spoke. "Lila's painting," she said softly. She drew the basement and the details of what happened. "It's vivid, more than just art. It's a record." That afternoon, Reed and his team visited the hospital. Lila, though still weak, sat up in bed, clutching her sketchpad. Claire sat beside her, encouraging her gently. "Sweetheart, the police need your help," Claire said. "Your drawing can show them what Dad did, and how Victor is involved." Lila hesitated, her small hands trembling. I don't want to remember," she whispered. Claire wrapped her arms around her daughter, tears in her eyes. "I know it's hard, but you're so brave, Lila. Your art can stop him from hurting anyone else." Taking a deep breath, Lila handed the sketchpad to Detective Reed. He flipped through the pages, his face growing serious. The painting of the basement was detailed, capturing the cold, stark reality of what Lila had endured. It showed the locked door, the icy floor, and even the faint imprint of Mark's shoes near the entrance. "This is incredible," Reed said, his voice filled with admiration. "It's exactly what we need." That evening, a team of officers surrounded Victor's estate. Claire insisted on staying nearby, refusing to be sidelined. She watched from a safe distance as the officers prepared to move in, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside the estate, Victor sat in his luxurious study, sipping whiskey. He glanced at his phone, smirking as he reviewed updates from his informants. "They think they can outsmart me," he muttered. "Fools." Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Victor jumped to his feet as officers stormed the room. "Victor Reynolds, you're under arrest," Detective Reed announced, his gun trained on him. Victor sneered, his arrogance intact. "Do you know who I am? You can't touch me." "We already have," Reed replied coolly, holding up the sketchpad. "Thanks to Lila, we have everything we need to expose your crimes." Victor's expression faltered as officers cuffed him. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll regret this." Later that night, Claire returned to the hospital, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion but her heart lighter. Lila was awake, her eyes brightening as Claire entered. "Is it over?" Lila asked softly. Claire knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart. Victor's been arrested. He won't hurt anyone ever again." Lila smiled faintly, relief washing over her. "I'm glad." Claire hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You were so brave, Lila. Your art saved us." In the following weeks, life began to rebuild itself. Mark was sentenced for his role in the conspiracy, and Victor's empire crumbled under the weight of the investigation. Claire and Lila moved to a small, quiet town near Boulder, where they started fresh. Claire opened a small art studio, showcasing Lila's work alongside her own. Lila's paintings, filled with emotion and hope, became a source of inspiration for the community. Her story, shared through her art, resonated with others who had faced their own struggles. On Christmas Eve, a year after the ordeal, Claire and Lila sat together in their cozy new home. Small Christmas tree adorned the corner, its lights twinkling softly. Lila handed Claire a wrapped canvas, her cheeks pink with excitement. "Open it," Lila urged. Claire unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a painting of the two of them standing together under a starry sky. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the vibrant colors and the love captured in every stroke. "It's beautiful," Claire whispered. "Just like you." Lila smiled, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I love you, Mom. I love you too." "Lila," Claire said, holding her daughter close. Together, they watched the snow fall gently outside, their hearts filled with peace and the promise of a brighter future.